Do US franchises need extra-provincial registration? US franchises love Canada because the market is familiar, the culture is similar, and brand recognition often crosses the border easily. But once you step into a Canadian province, the legal system wants to know who is actually doing business on its territory. That is where extra-provincial registration comes into the picture. The core question is whether a US franchisor or its Canadian master franchisee needs to be registered in the provinces where franchise locations operate. The answer depends on who signs the contracts, who owns or leases property, and how the franchise model is structured. Franchisor, franchisee, and who is doing business. In many franchise systems, the local Canadian franchisee owns the store, hires the staff, and signs the lease. The US franchisor sits behind the scenes, granting rights to use the brand and systems in exchange for fees. In that setup, the franchisee is clearly carrying on business in the province and must be properly incorporated and registered there. The franchisor, however, is still doing business in a quieter way. It is licensing trademarks, providing training and support, and collecting royalties that come from economic activity in the province. Whether that level of involvement triggers extra-provincial registration depends on the statutory definition of carrying on business in each province and on how directly the franchisor touches assets and contracts in that jurisdiction. Direct franchising versus master franchise structures. If the US franchisor contracts directly with each local franchisee in several provinces, then the franchisor has a direct and ongoing relationship in each of those provinces. Over time, that pattern usually points towards some combination of extra-provincial registration or Canadian entity acting as franchisor. If the US franchisor instead grants a master franchise to a Canadian corporation, and that Canadian master franchisee signs all sub-franchise agreements and deals with local operators, the US entity's direct footprint inside each province may be smaller. The master franchisee is the one clearly carrying on business province by province, and it will typically handle its own extra-provincial registrations. Neither model automatically eliminates registration for the US franchisor, but the master franchise approach often concentrates provincial registrations in a single Canadian company rather than in the foreign parent. Leases, guarantees, and centralized contracts. Even in franchise systems where the local franchisee runs the store, the franchisor often steps into large contracts. Many brands like to control real estate, so the franchisor or a related entity signs the head lease and then subleases to the franchisee. Others centralize supply agreements or national advertising contracts. Each time the franchisor signs a lease or major contract governed by the law of a Canadian province, especially if it takes on obligations to landlords or suppliers in that province, the argument that it is carrying on business there becomes stronger. That is often the moment lawyers will recommend extra-provincial registration, even if all storefront operations are technically in the franchisee's hands. Franchise disclosure laws and local visibility. On top of corporate rules, several provinces have franchise disclosure statutes that regulate how franchisors offer and sell franchises within their borders. These laws usually expect franchisors to provide a compliant disclosure document and to follow specific timing rules before a franchise agreement is signed. Complying with those laws often requires the franchisor to be visible to provincial regulators and courts. Extra-provincial registration of the franchisor or of a Canadian affiliate is a common part of that visibility. It shows there is a real entity within reach of local enforcement if something goes wrong. When extra-provincial registration is almost guaranteed. If your franchise brand is opening multiple units in a province, signing leases, entering long-term supply agreements, and repeatedly collecting royalties from operators there, it is rare that you can avoid provincial registration in some form. The only question is whether that registration sits with a Canadian subsidiary or with the US franchisor itself. When the plan includes a national rollout, it is often more efficient to create a Canadian corporation to act as the franchisor for all provinces and then register that corporation extra-provincially wherever franchises are located. That structure concentrates compliance and protects the US parent behind a corporate shield. Final thoughts. US franchises do not automatically need extra-provincial registration just because one Canadian customer appears. But as soon as you start opening real locations, signing leases, and operating a repeatable model in a province, some entity in your structure will need to be on that province's corporate registry. The practical decision is whether you want the US franchisor itself to be that entity, or whether you would rather put a Canadian corporation in front and let it handle provincial registrations. If you are mapping out a Canadian franchise rollout, our website has checklists that tie together franchise law, EPR, and tax planning in one place. If you require assistance with Canadian tax matters, our team is ready to provide reliable professional support. Please contact us at 416-283-8774 or visit theaccountingandtax.com for more information. And if you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.